Today's video is going to cover Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was raised in the South during the Civil War, and some of those things, especially in civil rights, is come to seen during his presidency. He studied law at Princeton, and he became governor of New Jersey, and he was seen as a progressive governor, so it made sense that that progressiveness was going to carry into his term as president. When Wilson became president, one thing he wanted to work on was financial reforms, and you'll see that as we go through. But he wanted to give greater freedom to the average citizens, and so what he called his presidency or his plans was New Freedom, and that was his policy. And through New Freedom, he wanted to go against what he called the triple wall of privilege, and that is the trusts, tariffs, and high finance. And so those were the three things that he was really fighting against while president through his New Freedom policy. With trusts, a lot like with Roosevelt, we could see him kind of as a trust buster. While he was president, Congress enacted the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. This was just another reform to strengthen the poorly written Sherman Antitrust Act. The Clayton Antitrust Act prohibited corporations from acquiring the stock of another if doing so would create a monopoly. It also allowed unions to exist. There was one person in particular who was very excited about this Clayton Antitrust Act and allowing unions, and that was Samuel Gompers. And you might remember him from the past, but he was the president of the AFL, or the American Federation of Labor, and this was a whole group of labor unions, and he saw the need for having unions to help out the people, and so he was really glad to see the Clayton Antitrust Act being passed in Congress while Wilson was president. The way that he was able to bust trust was through the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission was established through the Federal Trade Act to investigate possible violations in places like the meatpacking plants and in railroads. Wilson wanted a new freedom, his policy, for the people in order to slow down big businesses. And one way to do that was by lowering tariffs, or money coming from imports and exports. So he lowered tariff rates through an act called the Underwood Act in 1913. The only thing with this Underwood Act and lowering tariffs is that that's how the government got a lot of their money, was through tariffs. And so now that with this Underwood Act, they needed a new way to bring in money. And so that's when we get the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment legalized a graduated federal income tax, or a tax on what you would make at work. And under this new tax, larger incomes were taxed at a higher rate and then smaller ones. So if you had a higher income, you'd be taxed at a higher rate, and if you had a smaller income, you'd be taxed less. The government quickly realized that this was a way better way than having high tariffs, how they've done it for years. So this was a really good thing, the 16th Amendment and the graduated income tax. Another focus of Wilson's presidency was financial reform and banks, because the banks had been run the same way for a long time, just through central banks, and this hadn't really been working the best, and he wanted to fix that. So what he did is he created a decentralized private banking system, and what decentralized means is going from central to local government, because those central banks were in places like New York and in big cities, and they were really hard to access in the West and the Midwest. So if those smaller banks needed any help, it would usually take a long time, and it just wasn't very efficient. So he made a decentralized private banking system, and with that comes the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 divided the nation into 12 districts, and it established a regional central bank in each district. So these central banks served the others in the district. Okay, so 12 districts, one central one in each district, and so then all the little banks in each district were served by that central bank. These central banks in each 12 districts could also issue new paper currency in emergency situations, and they could lend money to banks who were in trouble. So instead of them just closing down because they couldn't get to the national central bank, they could go to their regional central bank and get assistance. We called these 12 districts and the banks the Federal Reserve System, and at this time almost 70% of all banks were a part of that Federal Reserve System. So that kind of covers a little bit of what Wilson wanted while president in his first term. But we also see a big change with women, because we've looked at some of the progressive women and all their efforts and how they failed. But really, through Wilson, they were able to succeed. And three things happened that really helped them eventually win suffrage, which is the right to vote. One of them was an increase of activism of local groups. So it wasn't just the big national groups, it was the local groups starting to spring up. Number two, the use of new strategies to build enthusiasm for the movement. And three was the rebirth of the national movement under Carrie Chapman Catt. She came after Susan B. Anthony, and she was president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, so the NAWSA. We've looked at that before. Chapman Catt brought 5 tactics with her when dealing with women's suffrage, or 5 things that she thought would really help her in her quest to win women the right to vote. One of those was through painstaking organization of the union, or her workers' association. Another one was a close tie between local, state, and national workers. Number 3 was establishing a wide base of support. Number 4 was cautious lobbying to politicians. And number 5 was a gracious, ladylike behavior in all her actions. So that's kind of interesting, number 5, the ladylike behavior, because there were some women who didn't agree with that. And some of those were Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, also women out to win women the right to vote, and they were able to establish a more radical National Women's Party. The National Women's Party didn't really practice the gracious, ladylike behavior. They did things like picketing at the White House, and if they were arrested for that, they would go on hunger strikes in the jail. What eventually led to women winning the right to vote was World War I, something we'll get to in the future. Women's actions during World War I were what won them the right to vote, because they had really strong efforts during the war, and they would get all these committees together to try and help out the men fighting. And so Congress saw that and decided that it was time for them to get the right to vote. And so then we get the 19th Amendment.